Happy New Year, everybody. Can you believe it's 2025? I hope you all had a great holiday season and welcome to Sweatpants and Strategy. We made it to 2025. Woohoo, woohoo, woohoo. Sweatpants and Strategy is a podcast that I started everything SBA from best practices to professional advice. I am Dana Hirschkowitz, your host and founder of the Dana Company. The Dana Company is an executive search firm where I place SBA professionals with national lenders. Let's loosen up our sweatpants and get into this week's pod. We welcome back Patrick Mizell, who is the president of the SBA division over at United Community Bank. We also welcome back Darren Davis, who is the SBA president at Colony Bank. And a lot of you know her. She's my right hand, Lindsay Blanks, who is currently a business banker over at Hancock Whitney. And today we have a newbie, Amy Perella, who has over 20 years of experience in banking, 8 with SBA. She is currently a successful business development officer at Harvest Bank. Let's get into this week's pod. We are talking everything and anything business development officers, from characteristics to best traits, what makes them successful. Let's put on our thinking caps and get started into this week's podcast. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me on 2025 first podcast. We have Amy, Lindsay, Darren, Patrick. Hi, guys. Happy New Year. Did you guys have a good holiday?
I did.
You did? Can you believe it's 2025?
Does not feel like.
No. And can you believe it's like below zero? Because Lindsay's wearing like the hat and Lindsay, you look so funny. You look so cute.
It's cold.
It is cold, I know. Well, let's get started on this week's podcast. We are discussing anything and everything business development officers. Here's a great question that I thought I would throw out there. So, what are the top 3 characteristics, traits of what makes a successful or a good BDO?
So I think 3 things that make a good BDO would be communication, organization, and I'm just going to say hungry, like that you're motivated. You just get it done.
So Lindsay and Amy, you guys are very, successful, what we call business development officers, but for all intent purposes, Lindsay, you're a business banker where you do both.
Yes.
And then we have Patrick and Darren who run the divisions. So, Darren, what do you think are the top 3 traits?
Well, I think Lindsay nailed a few of them. Teamwork is a good one too. I think communication is very important. Also, just knowledge both of SBA and of credit as well in the process.
Amy?
One that I haven't heard from the group yet, and it's huge, is listening.
Yeah.
Because how are you? I mean, and I'm ADD is real. I'm very guilty of this. And I came up kind of where I work for a non-bank lender now. I was your traditional business banker, in the larger corporate bank setting. And I used to be very guilty just because I'd been doing it for so long. You're a couple minutes into a conversation, your customer or client is telling you what he or she thinks that she needs. You've already kind of decided in your mind, just because you've been doing this for so long. And, you're usually right. But the way that's received on the other end doesn't feel so good to a client. So I think a very good BDO asks open-ended questions and then gives their person in that conversation time to respond. And, more or less us keep your ears open and mouth shut for a second to let them, tell you their story.
Good points. Well, let's finish with Patrick. You're going to bring it up the rear. Tell me.
Yeah. So I think the word I wrote down, and I think a few people alluded to it, was humble. And it's one that I think a lot of very successful BDOs sometimes fail at, but it helps you a lot with your internal sales, right? I mean, for the most part, people go out and make outbound calls and referral sources. franchisors, all the things that BDOs across the country do. But you really need that humble button when you're trying to sell a deal. But being humble will go a long way. And I think people were kind of mentioning that without saying the word humble.
I agree with everybody. I think that I could probably write a book
Yeah.
on, 20 years in the business looking for business development officers. And lately, it has not been that key of being humble, but the opposite. It's being an ego. And it's very hard for me to place a professional like that. I mean, recently when, there was a candidate and I asked him for a pipeline, and he's 20 years in the business and he refused to give it to me. And I said, they're trying to get to know you and you're going to get to know them. And his response was, I'm so and so, they're getting me. That's what they're paying for. So I really thought that ego has been a current, occurrence. So that's obviously not what makes a successful BDO. But actually, which goes to my two questions to Amy and Lindsay, there's a difference between having good characteristic traits, but what makes you guys, do you think, successful?
I would say consistency is key. I think a lot of BDOs are guilty of trying something and maybe it doesn't work the first time, which that happens a lot these days. Like the days of like one and done and I'm calling somebody and getting their business, first try or right off the bat, putting my, old banker hat back on. Those days are long gone. And to be quite honest, if something comes by that easily, you can lose it just as quickly, no matter who you are. So that's where Patrick's comment of ego comes back into play. You got to leave it at the door.
I would definitely follow up with a spout process on communication with certain things. I do it with my referral sources and my referral partners, including my branch teammates. I think that a lot of the referral sources, especially working at a bank where those referrals do come from, if you don't give them an update, they don't really understand the process anyway. But it at least allows them to keep the customer satisfied too. Because if they come in and they say, oh, I haven't heard from Lindsay or I haven't heard from Amy, like they get frustrated and then they go, well, what's going on? And they panic. So to help keep the panic to a minimum, and most, as we all know, it's quite the opposite of buying a house. So you can't go and ask your neighbor, like, how was your experience with this? Like there's not that many experiences that can be shared that way. And as we've all seen in some of Dana's podcasts, like even her hairdresser had the worst experience. Yes, that was, 7-8 years ago, but communication, played a huge role. It would have made a huge difference in Sam's experience. You got to be willing to learn. So no matter how long you've been in the game, I mean, this is my 5th year in the SBA world. And I know a ton of my peers that are 15, 20 years plus in this game. And just because you've been in the game for so long does not mean that you're as good or better than somebody else that's fresh in the game. I think it has to do with your will and your skill and then your motivation to learn and just keep on top of your game.
I mean, being in the industry, do you guys think that time, makes a difference?
I think it has to, right? Because I've got 20-year-olds on my team. Their experiences, their ability to use the computer is tenfold than people that have been doing it for 20 plus years. And I got people that are 20 years my senior still on my team. It really makes a big impact, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it depends. I think there's a big learning curve to kind of figure out how SBA lending works. And once you figure that out, the time doesn't matter as much anymore. I think it's more the hunger, because there's plenty of people out there for 20 years, like Lindsay was mentioning, that someone who's been around 5 is probably as good or not better than some. I don't think it's really based off time. There's a little bit of time involved because you got to get yourself up to speed, but that's where the hunger and really the humbleness comes in, to reach out and ask questions and say, I don't know, and finding out the people who can help out.
I'd like to go back, to the beginning of everybody's career and, definitely how it's changed from gaining the business, because now you have brokers. So I don't know, like Patrick, 20 years ago, you're a perfect sales guy. How did you cultivate business?
I swore I would never be the guy that was like, well, back in my day.
Oh, back in my day. Back in my day.
And unfortunately, I've like slapped myself on the wrist several
The
times.
insurance commercial. Don't
slap yourself. Oh no, back in my day, no.
But brokers are so interesting, and almost on the other podcast, I wish I'd have been a little more bullish on a couple of statements I made about that. Is, to me, it's one of the most concerning things in the industry as a whole right now. But that's another talk for another day. But there's so much competition. You can get on LinkedIn and see, a year-end special. We're paying 2.5%, 3% on all deals where a commitment letter is out before the end of Q3 and going back 10 or 15 years when I was talking to those brokers, they were delighted to get 1%. We were one of the few people paying. Everybody's paying, and everybody, looks at you like you're crazy when you say you're going to pay 1% with no cap. And so you have banks paying 2% on a $5 million single funding deal. That is probably the thing that gives me the most heartburn, because those folks are out there. That's how they're winning businesses, by paying more than everybody else. And the borrower has an impact. There's no way it doesn't impact the borrower.
So now you're not even looking at what's in the best interest of your borrower. So back to Amy's statement of, how we started, and that's the one thing I'll tell you is back to the communication part. I'm not transactional. I actually joked about it in the second podcast with Sam. Like, I want to know your kids. I want to know your dog's name. Do you have a guinea pig, a gecko? Like, come on, tell me about yourself. And Amy even mentioned it. Like, let them brag about themselves. There's nothing more that a small business owner wants to do is to tell you how
about themselves.
Yeah, you were like the work wife.
They love them. And I just sit there and listen, because it does tell you a lot about their character. And I think that our underwriters like to know that kind of stuff about them. I mean, heck, I got an RV loan approved with a person because, of course, I had to mitigate the risk, the startup RV park. And I was like, how do I mitigate this? Well, I pulled her credit report. She had 5 RV trade lines and a boat on there. That worked. And boy, let me tell you, they approved it. So sometimes you have to listen to what those people's hobbies are. And Brandy and them are about to open. So it's awesome.
But that's how you become successful, though. I mean, Amy, definitely a success story. Tell me a little bit about your beginnings.
I actually started on the retail side before I got into business banking. And I will say let me back up for a minute, because we were talking earlier about not having banking experience, not to go too far into the weeds. But when I was married to my ex-husband, he flew for the Navy. So, the old saying, like, if, your family would be issued in the ditty bag if they really gave them what your wife did for a living kind of thing. So yeah, my demo career, because I was a biology major, I had to change. So I was like, okay, well, what can I do? My dad owned his own business. So I thought, well, I used to sell for him, when I was in school. So let me I'll try, throw my hat in at a bank. And I just wanted a job, as far as that was concerned. And I started at Compass, which is now PNC, but then, transitioned to BBVA. And I met with their head of retail. And what he said to me is like, Amy, banking's really not that difficult. You've got something I can't teach, and that's drive. Like, nobody has to tell you to get up and go to work every day in the morning. Like Lindsay said, will and skill. If somebody's got the will and maybe doesn't have the skills, so, that you can teach a lot of that stuff, certainly with, the SBA, because another piece to being successful is, we all know it changes all the time. You've not only got to learn it, you got to unlearn it and then relearn it. So I think, like, maybe some of the, you mentioned some of the archaic folks, which this is my special birthday year. So I got to watch what I say about age, and just being consistent and doing all of those things. I came from outside banking, and I got in and I really liked it.
The one thing that has come up a lot with, me recruiting and talking to a lot of BDOs are brokers. How beneficial has working with brokers been for you? I guess everybody.
I'll step in on this. When I was a BDO, most of my business was from brokers, but they were loyal. So, the information out there, what was mentioned earlier about 3% fees over here and specials and all that stuff, it didn't really matter, because back then, once you got a broker and you showed you could perform, they were with you for a long time. These days, it's hard to keep a broker, I think. I'm constantly hearing our BDOs that have brokers, and they're constantly having to look for new ones because someone goes somewhere else because they got offered a higher fee somewhere.
Well, I mean, Amy, you guys Harvest uses brokers a lot, no?
I'm a little different though, because I came personally from the banking side. So that's where most of my referrals come from. When I started on the SBA side of the business, I came from the banks, and the banks didn't pay brokers, like unless it was an SBA loan. So I had to build my broker network. And this is nothing against brokers, but it's just like BDOs. There's good ones and there's mediocre ones. You know, you come across these brokers, well, so and so's paying X and da 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 da, and they think that they should get 3% when you're doing all the heavy lifting and they made a phone call. Now, I don't mind taking a cut in, you know, my commission, because that's literally how, you know, we're paid, or the brokers are paid is out of our pocket, like out of what my company pays me. If you're, you know, helping that client organize their paperwork and packaging and, you know, leading them to the place to actually have their business plan done, and, you know, you're doing something, sure, you know, okay. But I will say, you know, to Darren's point, it is a lot more difficult.
That's what I was going to ask you. You know, Patrick and Darren, you know, you can maybe do a little like men versus women. You know, these women are kicking it in, you know, as a BDO. And I'm not saying that men aren't either, but do you see a difference between the goals or how they're exceeding them? Or
I will say this, 2 of my best BDO hires have been moms of 4. So if you're asking me if I had to hire a BDO and you tell me you're a mom of 4 with maybe your youngest being under 2, I'm going to hire you. Simply because if you can manage a household of 4, manage a husband, and Lord knows we're not easy to manage, and you have one under 2 or 3, and you're still telling me you're going to close $15 million a year, you've got to work your ass off. You've got to be organized. All those traits we've had, if again, you have them all, just because your personal life, if you don't have those things, is a shit show anyway. If you're asking me who I've had the best success with, it's been moms of 4. And all the stinkers I've had have been guys. I'm betraying the brotherhood. So
To be really honest, I personally I'm competitive. But when it comes to, because I've had one particular BDO that I worked with, that was a man, that ego, boy, that doesn't even describe that man at all. He would just run over you. So if I knew that that was the case, instead of battering myself, I just walked away. And I raised my hand and like kind of waved the white flag, and then I would just go and get the next one. So it's kind of like, you know, how long do you spend out in the field making phone calls and doing the exact same things over and over again? You have to kind of figure out a way that makes you get more yeses. But at the end of the day, I can go and find the next deal and let him deal with something. And 9 times out of 10, what has happened when those deals have come through, this one in particular, it had so much hair on it. He was so ticked off. He was like, I can't believe you didn't fight me for this deal and blah, blah. And I'm like, nope, bye.
it goes back to the beginning of the podcast where you have to be humble. Because if you're not, then you're not going to get anything done. And, you know, whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, whether it's a dog, monkey, whatever, you know, you just want to, you know, be yourself and be honest. Don't you think that's probably end all be all what makes people successful?
Representing yourself and your shop is what's going to make, that's one of the absolute non-negotiables, in my opinion, in this business.
Whether it's a man or a woman beating their chest and big ego, that's got a negative effect on the other people on your team, the processors, the underwriters. And that's, you know, that's not worth it, no matter how much they produce. Nope. So, I mean, that's something that I consider too, as well as managers, Patrick and I do.
Ask them what their weaknesses are. And even the best BDO better have an answer, and it better not be, I don't have any, because everyone has them. And if somebody is full enough, like Patrick mentioned, to actually have some situational awareness and be able to tell you, like, this is what I do really well. This is, you know, what I would like to focus on or work on. I mean, I would think that as an employer, if I were still in management, which I do not ever want to manage people again. So more power to the 2 of you. You know, I think that would probably, Dana, help you cut through the crap.
Yeah, well, that shows the humbleness right there.
But I have one question for you guys before we end this. Who's coming back? Lindsay, who's coming back on my podcast? I think that, you know, I love you guys having, the panelists, and I think the next round, we'll dive into, the different jobs, what makes everybody, like an underwriter successful, and talk about, topics that you guys want to cover. So I love this. I love having all my friends on, and Amy, you've made it so great. And, like I said, you and Lindsay are my, versus women, we got that covered. So, but all of you guys, I know it's, the third and Friday, but thank you for being on this. And I really sorry about me goofing off the whole entire time, but
It's who you are.
That's
Yeah.
authentic.
Don't
It
apologize
makes
for
it
that.
fun.
Yeah.
oh no, you gotta
Yeah.
have some,
Never apologize.
you gotta have some fun. So I can't wait for the next podcast, and I need an idea. So just shoot it over to me. All
Thanks
right,
for the
guys.
time.
Thank
Thanks.
you. It's so
We'll see you all.
fun.
Have a good weekend.
Bye, guys. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this week's episode. I had a lot of fun. If you like what you saw, like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you guys next week.